August 1st, 1975. Helsinki, Finland. The ballroom of the Finlandia Hall is a vortex of flashbulbs and murmured diplomacy. The air is thick with the scent of polished wood, wool suits, and a palpable, performative optimism. The Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe is reaching its climax. For the Soviet delegation, led by General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, this is a moment of supreme validation. The West is here, signing documents that, in the Soviet reading, permanently legitimize the post-war borders of Eastern Europe. Brezhnev, his heavy frame adorned with medals, shakes hands with President Gerald Ford. The camera captures the firm, practiced smile of a man who believes he is presiding over a permanent historical achievement, geopolitical parity with the United States. But if you could pull back from the ceremony, past the cordons of KGB agents in their sharp suits, and travel 900 miles southeast to Moscow, you would witness a different reality. In a dimly lit, cavernous warehouse on the outskirts of the capital, a line of trucks is backed up for a quarter mile. They are not carrying missiles or tanks, the tools of the superpower spectacle. They are waiting for a delivery of meat. The foreman, a man named Victor with tired eyes, smokes a papyrosa cigarette, its harsh smoke mingling with the damp concrete smell. His clipboard holds a sheaf of rationing manifests and production quotas, none of which align. The illusion of plenty, a phrase muttered in kitchen table conversations across the 11 time zones of the USSR, is here, in this logistical breakdown, made manifest. The Soviet economy, the very engine meant to prove communism's superiority, is beginning to wheeze, not with a sudden explosion, but with the slow, grinding sigh of systemic failure. This is the core contradiction of the Soviet Union in the 1970s. On the world stage, it projects awe-inspiring power. Its nuclear arsenal rivals America's. Its submarines prowl every ocean. Its propaganda films show smiling workers surpassing steel production quotas. Yet this formidable edifice rests on an economic foundation not of titanium, but of rust and wishful thinking. The system is called the command economy. Every single economic decision, how many shoes to produce in Minsk, how much fertilizer to send to Ukraine, how many tons of steel to allocate to Siberia, is made by a vast bureaucracy in Moscow under the Gosplan agency. There is no feedback loop of price, no signal of consumer demand, only the diktat of the 5-year plan. For Leonid Brezhnev and the Politburo, the solution to the growing economic stagnation has, ironically, come from the very capitalist world they seek to defeat. Since the early 1970s, a river of petrodollars has begun flowing into Soviet coffers. Vast new oil and gas fields in western Siberia have come online. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 sent global crude prices skyrocketing. The USSR, suddenly, is an energy superpower. This isn't the result of brilliant economic planning or worker productivity. It is geological luck. And this windfall becomes a sedative. Hard currency from oil and gas sales floods in, allowing the leadership to paper over the deep structural cracks. They import Western grain to cover for failing collective farms. They purchase advanced machine tools and technology from Europe and Japan to plug gaps in their own industrial base. In the corridors of power, a dangerous complacency sets in. The term is zastoy, the era of stagnation. The revolutionary fervor of Lenin, the terror of Stalin, the chaotic experimentation of Khrushchev have all given way to a gerontocratic stability. The Politburo grows old together. Their primary goal is not dynamism or innovation, but the preservation of the system and their place within it. Promotion is based on loyalty and connections, not competence. The factory manager's priority is not to make a better product, but to report that he has fulfilled the quota, whether he does it by cutting corners, bartering for supplies on the black market, or simply falsifying paperwork. The worker, guaranteed a job and a tiny, meager apartment, has no incentive to work harder. The phrase, "they pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work," becomes a common, cynical joke. So, as Brezhnev returns from Helsinki in 1975, hailed for a foreign policy triumph, the economic reality is this. The Soviet Union is becoming a giant gas station masquerading as a superpower. Its industrial output is slowing. Its technology is falling a generation behind the West's digital revolution. Its agriculture is perennially dysfunctional. But the flow of oil money hides the sickness, allowing the leadership to avoid the painful, necessary reforms that would threaten their control. The patient is deteriorating, but is being kept in a stable-looking coma by a steady intravenous drip of crude oil. The crisis is not immediate, it is incubating. And the world price of oil, that life support system, is a variable utterly beyond the control of the Gosplan ministers in Moscow. a variable that one day will change. December 27, 1979. Moscow, the Kremlin. The winter dark comes early, swallowing the onion domes of St. Basil's and the stark granite of Lenin's mausoleum. Inside the Kremlin's innermost chambers, the air is thick with smoke and tension. A small circle of old men, the Politburo, debates a decision that will become a self-inflicted economic wound. Leonid Brezhnev, his speech slightly slurred from medication and fatigue, listens as the KGB chairman Yuri Andropov and defense minister Dmitry Ustinov make their final arguments. They speak of international duty, of preventing American encirclement, of shoring up a fraternal socialist regime in Kabul. The vote is taken. The order is given. That night, the 40th Army begins rolling across the Oxus River into Afghanistan. It is presented as a limited surgical intervention. But in the economic ledger of the empire, a new, devastating column has just been opened: the cost of a forever war. The Afghan war becomes a grinding, bloody drain on the very resources the Soviet system can least afford to spare. It is not just the rubles spent on bullets, helicopters, and boots, though those are immense. It is the opportunity cost. Scientific and engineering talent is funneled into military projects, not consumer goods or efficient factory machinery. Railway cars that could be carrying grain or consumer products are diverted for military logistics. The guns versus butter equation, which the West also struggled with, becomes catastrophic for an economy already producing butter so poorly it must import it. The war also triggers a swift and punishing response from the West. President Jimmy Carter and later Ronald Reagan institute a series of measures that precisely target the USSR's economic lifeline. High-tech exports are embargoed. Credit lines are frozen. Most critically, the U.S. works relentlessly to suppress the world price of oil and to sabotage Soviet energy infrastructure. The CIA's operation to provide faulty pipeline technology to the Soviets, causing a monumental explosion in the Trans-Siberian pipeline in 1982, is just one silent, devastating blow. Then the other blade of the double-edged sword falls. In the early 1980s, the global oil glut begins. Saudi Arabia, aligned with U.S. interests, opens the spigots. The price of crude, which had peaked near $40 a barrel, begins a sickening plunge. By 1986, it will hover around $10. For the Soviet Union, this is not a market adjustment. It is a heart attack. The river of hard currency becomes a trickle. The credit they had relied upon to buy grain is now called in. The Gospelin's entire fantasy budget, built on the assumption of high energy prices, is exposed as a ledger of lies. The store shelves, once sporadically stocked with imported goods to placate the populace, grow barren. Now the defining symbol of Soviet life is no longer the missile parade, but the queue. Stand in a queue in Leningrad in 1983. It is a cold, damp entity, a silent social contract of shared misery. You do not even know what you are queuing for, only that something has arrived. It could be substandard Polish shoes, Bulgarian canned meat, or the mythical Soviet toilet paper. You wait for hours, babushkas wrapped in shawls, factory workers still in their coveralls, all held together by a weary, cynical patience. This is the economy of deficit. Everything is scarce except time and frustration. The black market, the tallcatch, the fixer, and black connections become more vital to survival than the official state salary. The system has not just failed to produce prosperity, it has failed to produce normalcy. A profound disillusionment sets in, a quiet understanding that the social contract, obedience in exchange for security, is being broken by the state itself. Into this atmosphere of decay steps a new generation. In March 1985, following the rapid deaths of Brezhnev's two feeble successors, a younger, energetic figure takes the helm. Mikhail Gorbachev, with his distinctive birthmark and easy smile, understands the depth of the crisis. He knows the economy is bleeding out. He speaks openly of uskorne, acceleration, and more famously, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. His aim is not to destroy the Soviet system, but to save it through radical reform. He begins by launching a disastrous anti-alcohol campaign to sober up the workforce, which instead drains the state budget of vital tax revenue. Then he tinkers with enterprise laws, hoping to inject a dose of market-like accountability. But Gorbachev, a creature of the party, is trying to perform open heart surgery on a patient using only the tools of political propaganda. He loosens the chains of control without understanding that the economy, like a paralyzed limb, has no muscle memory of how to function on its own. The command economy's arteries are sclerotic. Simply telling them to work better is futile. And with glasnost, he unleashes a force far more dangerous than economic criticism: the truth. For the first time, television programs broadcast the empty shelves, the horrific environmental disasters like the Chernobyl meltdown in 1986 and the grisly cost of the Afghan war. The legitimizing myth of the state, that it was leading its people to a brighter future, evaporates under the harsh light of open disclosure. The economic crisis is now a visible, discussable, and therefore insurmountable fact. January 1st, 1990. Moscow Gum Department Store. The grand, glass-roofed arcade facing Red Square, a temple to consumerism in the heart of communism, is a theater of the absurd. It is New Year's Day, a time for celebration. Instead, a tense, shoving crowd masses before closed metal shutters. The few open counters have lines that snake through the ornate galleries like desperate serpents. The issue is no longer just scarcity, it is monetary anarchy. Gorbachev's reforms, designed to decentralize economic control, have instead ripped the last functioning levers out of the state's hands. A decree allowing limited cooperative enterprises, essentially small private businesses, has created a class of new rich, the co-operators, who buy up scarce goods from state stores at low fixed prices only to resell them on the black market at astronomical markups. Inflation, a word once alien to the planned economy, is now a roaring beast. The ruble in a citizen's pocket is becoming confetti, its value evaporating by the hour. The fatal move, however, was made in the halls of the Supreme Soviet just months before. In a desperate bid to regain control and appear reform-minded, Gorbachev's government has passed the law on state enterprises. It is a catastrophic piece of well-intentioned legislation. The law grants factory managers near total autonomy from Gospelin's dictates, but leaves the old, distorted price controls firmly in place. The result is immediate economic carnage. Managers, now free to seek profit but with prices still artificially low, stop producing anything that isn't wildly profitable. They halt shipments to other Soviet republics unless paid in hard currency. They hoard raw materials. The intricate, if inefficient, web of supply that stretched from Riga to Vladivostok snaps. One republic finds itself with a surplus of light bulbs but no bread. Another has mountains of coal but no soap. The unified economic space of the USSR, the very justification for the Union, ceases to function. Now witness the collapse from the perspective of a factory director in Sverdlovsk. His name is Anatoly. For decades, his factory produced heavy gears for tractors, sent to assembly plants in Belarus and Ukraine. His quota was set in Moscow, his steel allocated from Magnitogorsk, his buyers assigned. Now with the new law, he stares at an invoice from his Ukrainian customer, offering worthless rubles. Meanwhile, a Swedish firm has contacted him, offering hard currency, Deutschmarks, for a different type of gear. Anatoly makes the only rational choice. He stops the tractor gear line, retools a section of the factory, and sends his product to Sweden. The tractor plant in Minsk grinds to a halt for lack of gears. The collective farms that depend on those tractors cannot harvest. The dominoes fall with terrifying speed. The system isn't being outcompeted. It is committing suicide by adhering to half measures. Gorbachev, the reformer, is now trapped between the anvil of economic reality and the hammer of political revolt. The Baltic republics, seeing the central government's impotence and emboldened by glasnost, declare economic sovereignty, refusing to send their goods to Moscow. In the Russian Soviet Federative Republic, a new political force emerges with a bald, populist mayor of Moscow at its forefront, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin understands the raw, public anger over empty shops in a way Gorbachev, ensconced in the Kremlin with his special supply system, does not. He directly challenges the authority of the Union, positioning Russia itself as a competitor to the Soviet state. In June 1990, Yeltsin stands before the Russian parliament and declares Russia's sovereignty, a move that essentially declares the Russian government, not the Soviet one, the owner of Russia's vast natural resources. The economic base of the empire is legally pulled out from under it. The final, decisive blow is economic, not military. In the summer of 1990, Gorbachev and his advisors, including the young reformer Grigory Yavlinsky, craft a desperate plan called the 500 Days Program, a rapid shock therapy transition to a market economy. But Gorbachev, fearful of the social unrest it will cause and under pressure from hardline communists, balks at the last moment. He retreats, seeking a compromise that satisfies no one. The state's credibility is utterly spent. The West, seeing the chaos, refuses large-scale financial aid, fearing it will be poured into a black hole. By the winter of 1990-1991, the Soviet Union faces hyperinflation, the complete breakdown of inter-republic trade, and the specter of mass famine in the cities. The government resorts to printing money to cover its deficits, completing the ruble's destruction. The economy isn't just failing, it has entered a state of terminal, systemic seizure. The political bonds of the Union, strained for decades, are now severed by the simple, brutal calculus of survival, every republic for itself. August 19, 1991. Moscow, a dacha in the suburb of Arkhangelskoye. Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of a union that no longer functionally exists, is a prisoner in his own vacation home. Troops from the KGB Alpha unit surround the compound, cutting the phone lines. Inside, Gorbachev, refusing to resign or cooperate, paces with a mixture of fury and despair. In Moscow, a cabal of hardliners, the vice president, the prime minister, the heads of the KGB and the military, announced the formation of the State Committee on the State of Emergency. Tanks roll into the city, their treads clattering on the asphalt, a sound not heard in the capital since World War II. They have launched a coup to halt the collapse, to restore the old discipline, to save the Union. But they have fatally misdiagnosed the disease. They believe this is a political crisis that can be solved with a show of force. It is not. It is an economic extinction event. The tanks are irrelevant. The balance sheet has already cleared. The coup collapses in 3 days, not because of superior military opposition, but because the economic reality had already made the Soviet state a phantom. The factory managers, like Anatoly and Sverdlovsk, did not stop their machines for the junta. The train conductors in Kazakhstan did not resume shipments of grain to Moscow on their orders. The miners in Ukraine, who had been on strike for months over unpaid wages and empty stores, did not return to the pits. The state could no longer command obedience because it could no longer fulfill its most basic promises: to pay wages that had value, to stock the shelves, to maintain order. When Boris Yeltsin, defying the tanks from the atop one outside the Russian parliament, declared the coup illegal, he was giving voice to a power that had already shifted. The real authority now lay with the republics who controlled the resources, and with the street where people were no longer afraid. In the wake of the failed coup, the dissolution is not a dramatic explosion, but a swift, administrative acknowledgement of a fait accompli. The economic ligaments have been severed. Now the political skeleton is formally dismantled. One by one, the Soviet republics declare their independence. Ukraine, the breadbasket, votes for independence on December 1st. The most powerful symbol of the end comes not from a battlefield, but from a hunting lodge. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk, and Stanislav Shushkevich, meet in a secluded Belarusian forest at Belazhia. They do not sign a treaty of war or peace. They sign a document stating that the USSR as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality is ceasing its existence. They dissolve the Union and form a loose commonwealth of independent states. It is a divorce settlement for a bankrupt estate. 25 million ethnic Russians now find themselves living outside of Russia's new borders. The world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons is scattered across 4 new nations. An entire generation is thrust into a capitalist wilderness for which they are utterly unprepared. But the root cause, the silent killer, was economic. The Soviet Union did not lose a hot war. It did not succumb to a mass, violent revolution in the streets. It was killed by 1,000 cuts of inefficiency, by the tractor gear that was never shipped, by the oil price that crashed, by the ruble that turned to dust, by the queue that became a permanent fixture of life. It collapsed because its economic system could not generate information, real prices, real demand, and therefore could not adapt. It produced missiles it could not afford and failed to produce toilet paper its people needed. The final, haunting image is of December 25, 1991. At 7:35 p.m. Moscow time, Mikhail Gorbachev appears on Soviet television for the last time. He signs a decree relinquishing his control of the nuclear arsenal and resigns as president of a country that has already vanished. Minutes later, the red hammer and sickle flag over the Kremlin is lowered in the winter darkness and replaced with the Russian tricolor. There is no ceremony, no 21-gun salute. The transition is as quiet as the closing of a ledger. The Soviet experiment, born in the fiery promise of a worker's paradise, died in the cold, silent logic of a failed balance sheet. It was not a clash of armies that decided its fate, but a more profound defeat. The inability to put food on the table, a price the most powerful state on earth could not command its own economy to pay.